All right. Okay. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kunling Nations on whose land our major campuses operate, and I broadcast from today. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. With online learning and remote working, people may be based elsewhere or interstate, so I pay my respect to traditional owners of the land from wherever you may be joining us. Welcome to Monash lecture series. I'm Erta Xiao. This lecture series is organized by the Department of Economics and our Behavioral and Experimental Economics Research Group. Today, I'm really thrilled to have David Rand with us. David is a professor of management science and brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, also the director of the Applied Cooperation Team. David conducts interdisciplinary work that combines cognitive science, behavioral economics, and social psychology to understand people's attitude, beliefs, and choices. His work has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the American Economic Review, Psychological Science, and Management Science. His research has received widespread attention from media. His most recent work focuses on illuminating why people believe and share misinformation and fake news, questions that many of us, I believe, are probably increasingly interested these days. So today's talk will be 1 hour and 10 minutes presentation, followed by 20 minutes discussion. During the presentation, you may ask clarifying questions, and we ask you to leave discussion questions to the end. If you have any question, please raise your hand or write it in the chat box. Our graduate student, Zhongwen here, will help with moderating the Q&A. Without further ado, David, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much for the invitation. I'm happy to tell you all about work that me and my collaborators have been doing for the last, I guess, maybe 6 years at this point on, trying to understand, why people believe and share fake news. And I'll also use the chat window to drop links to papers, like relevant papers throughout as I go. Obviously falsehoods are nothing new, like they've been around since communication began, but there's a particular flavor of falsehood that has gotten this number of fake news that kind of came to general attention in 2016 in the context of the US presidential election and Brexit in the UK, in which these completely false, totally fabricated statements were presented as if they were sort of true factual news and received a lot of traction on social media in addition to other places. And then, there was a redoubling of concern around this as the COVID pandemic began, where in parallel with the real pandemic, there was an infodemic of misinformation that began and has continued, to this day. Then, in the US during the 2020 presidential election, got like another round of the different flavor of like widespread falsehoods around claims of widespread election fraud. And although most of the research has focused on the US and occasionally Western Europe and the UK, the misinformation really is very much a global problem. And from talking to people at social media companies, they say it's actually much more of a problem outside of the US and the West. And so I feel like there's this general sense that this is an important problem and we should be trying to understand why people believe falsehoods, why we share them, and what interventions can be used to counter misinformation. And that's what I'm going to sort of give you an overview of today. This review article that we published in TICS last year gives an overview of a lot of this work. So I popped in the chat a link to the paper and also a tweet thread that summarizes it and a short 15-minute video summary. And so I'm going to start by talking about the question of like belief and what makes people believe falsehoods, or more generally, what makes people believe things one way or the other. And what we sort of outlined in this paper is that there's one set of factors that are associated with just belief, regardless of whether things are true or false or not, which is what I'm going to start with. So these are things that just like make you believe something more regardless of its actual truth value. And so the first of these factors is repetition. This is a phenomena that has been known in cognitive psychology for 30 or 40 years. And I think it's been known by politicians for, much longer than that, which is essentially if you repeat a claim, repeatedly being exposed to a claim makes it feel more accurate. And prior to 2016, this had been shown with all kinds of weird random trivia questions. And we showed it was even true with very sort of obviously false political news. And so to give you a flavor for how these kinds of experiments, in this paper, we showed people a set of 12 headlines, half true, half false, half sort of favoring conservatives, half favoring liberals. We presented them as if they were Facebook, in the same format of Facebook. And we asked them, would you consider sharing the story online? And so this is like the exposure phase where we expose people to 12 headlines. Then they go through a distractor stage where they just do a bunch of irrelevant stuff. And then in the assessment stage, we show them the 12 headlines that we showed them at the beginning, and we also show them 12 new headlines. And this time we ask them, to the best of your knowledge, how accurate is the above headline? And what we randomize, of these 24 headlines, we randomize which ones get shown at the beginning and which ones that don't. And so then we have a sort of experimentally generated variation in whether the headlines are novel or familiarized. The novel being the ones that we didn't show in the first stage, the familiarized being the ones that we did show in the first stage. And then we just look at the accuracy ratings. And so here I'm going to show you the fraction of the false stories that in that second stage, participants thought were accurate. What you see is that these stories, by and large, were pretty unbelievable, and only about 18% of the stories are believed at baseline, but a single exposure 5 minutes earlier substantially increases the fraction of headlines that people believe to be false. And we found that this was true regardless of whether the headlines aligned with your politics or not, and regardless of whether they were true or false. So even if you were being exposed to falsehoods that you didn't want to believe, just the mere exposure caused you to believe it more. We did a 1-week follow-up. The effect was still there. We found that it compounded across multiple exposures. And then another paper, we found that using a bunch of different measures of cognitive sophistication, people that were more cognitively sophisticated, who engaged in more reasoning and things like that, that doesn't protect you. And they were just as susceptible to these exposure effects as people that were sort of less cognitively sophisticated, more intuitive, and so on. So, the implication of this is that exposure is like a really powerful factor for shaping people's beliefs, and is something that if you repeatedly expose people to falsehoods, will make them more likely to believe those falsehoods. Okay. Another factor that is been very robustly shown to increase people's belief in things is the extent to which, if they're assessing a new piece of information, a new piece of news, something like that, how well it lines up with their already existing beliefs, excuse me, is a big predictor of how much they believe it. They're more likely to believe things that align with what you already believe in the first place. And this matters for a lot of different reasons, but one reason it matters is when you're thinking about politics and this issue of different people, people from the two different parties having sort of different factual realities and believing different sets of facts. That actually it kind of makes sense because if you're exposed to different information streams, like in the US, if you have one person that's watching Fox News all the time and only seeing conservative news, you never have another person that's watching MSNBC all the time and only seeing liberal news, they're going to have very different factual beliefs about the world. And so if they showed those two people the same new piece of information, they're going to judge it differently. And that's not actually necessarily evidence of bias. It's actually consistent with rational Bayesian belief updating. When there's uncertainty about how reliable the source is, when you get a new piece of information, you have to both say, well, how diagnostic do I think this information is? And so how much should I change my beliefs about the relevant, the topic that the news is about, but also how reliable do I think the source is? And I have to update my beliefs about the reliability of the source. And so if the headline is crazy and I'm not sure about the source, then it's actually rational to conclude that probably the source was bad rather than everything else I knew about the world was wrong. And so this means that even absent any kind of politically motivated reasoning or anything like that, just everyone doing their best to have true, accurate beliefs, you can get this kind of fragmentation where people in different political groups wind up with very different beliefs if they're exposed to different sort of information inputs. And also consistent with this, there's evidence that people that engage in more reasoning rely on their priors to a greater extent when they're evaluating new information. And so, as kind of foreshadowed by this bit about the reliability of the source being important, a third factor that increases belief, regardless of whether the content is true or not, is the source and how much you trust the source. So there's a huge amount of evidence that in general, people are more likely to believe claims that come from trusted sources. Where trusted can mean different things in different contexts, but in general, the more reliable you think the source is, the more you believe things that they tell you. And one particular form of trusted source that I think is relevant in the kind of political fake news domain is political elites. The members of the political elite are often, trusted by their supporters. There's a big literature in political science that shows the power of elite cues, where if elites, say this is a good idea or this thing is true, the people in their party are more like, oh yeah, okay, they've shifted substantially in that direction. And if you find out that members, like the elites from the other party, support something, it moves you in the opposite direction. You saw this sort of quite remarkably during Donald Trump's presidency, where he just like dramatically changed certain parts of the Republican platform, like policy stances that had been core elements of Republican platform. He was like, no, this other thing. And people are like, oh, okay, well, I guess this other thing now. So elites really have a huge amount of power, and they also have really big platforms where they, can influence. So basically, they have the power, the reach, and the power to influence a lot of people. Sorry, let's see. And so that doesn't mean though that like it's there's nothing that you can do. There is this sense that maybe people just listen to elites no matter what, and ignore information that goes against what trusted sources or elites are saying, but that's not actually true. Like we have a paper, for example, where you see that if you show people the elite, the party, the Q is saying this is what your preferred party leader thinks about this issue, and here's an argument against that position, people are as influenced by the argument whether or not they know that the party elite stance. So basically, like, people do respond to arguments, and I think the main issue is just that people are much less likely to be exposed to arguments that go against the positions that they believe. Or when they get those messages, those arguments, they're coming from sources that they've already written off. So they get like lots of messaging on confirming what they believe from sources that they trust, and they're much less exposed to credible counter arguments from at least sort of neutral sources. So if you put all of this together, we say that like there are these three different factors that can all cause you to believe something more, regardless of whether it's true or not: repetition, alignment with your pre-existing beliefs, and coming from sources that you trust. And now what I'm going to do in the next section is talk about things that, rather than just being causing belief, period, this is looking for factors that are specifically related to belief in false claims, so things that make you more susceptible to false claims. And there's sort of two of these that we're going to talk about. They are, first is a lack of reasoning or a lack of critical thinking. When I say reasoning, there's a lot of different things that go under that umbrella, but our sort of favorite measure, because it's simple and it captures a lot of behavior, is the cognitive reflection test. It's this measure from, it was developed by Shane Frederick. It's used a lot in behavioral econ and cognitive science. And it's this set of questions that have intuitively compelling but wrong answers. So my favorite example is when you're running a race and you pass the person in second place, what place are you in? For most people, first place immediately pops to mind, and you might write it down, or you might stop and think for like 1 second and be like, oh wait, no, actually when you pass the person second place, now you're in second place. And so the standard approach is you have people fill out this measure, and then you just score it so that the more correct answers they give, you say the more analytic thinking they're engaging in. And so in the particular data that I'm going to show you, just as an example, although we've done this like probably 40 experiments or something like at this point with like a million different variations. In this one, we had them do the CRT, and then we also showed them a set of headlines, a third of which were true, a third of which were totally false, and a third of which were kind of hyper partisan. They weren't like literally false, but they were like very misleading and biased. And then they asked for each one a sort of, is this accurate and unbiased or not? So they should only say yes to the true, and they should say no for both the hyper partisan and the false. And then what I'm going to show you is the fraction of headlines that were rated as accurate and unbiased based on the fraction of questions that they got right on the CRT, and whether the headlines were true, hyperpartisan, or false. And this is a sort of standard pattern that we've seen over countless experiments, where there's not much of a relationship between CRT and the rating of the true headlines, but the people that are more reflective, so that engage in more of the sort of critical thinking, are less likely to believe the false or misleading headlines. And here the sizes of the circles are proportional to the number of observations in each bin. This study was one with a like fairly representative sample, and so you see the part of the problem is most of the people are really doing quite bad on the CRT. So the people that are getting the questions wrong, they're not very discerning in terms of how much they believe the true versus the misleading or false ones, whereas the people that are doing very well in the CRT, they believe the true ones much more than they believe the hyperpartisan or false ones. And as I said, this is just one example. We've got a ton of evidence that people that are more likely to go with their gut are more likely to believe false claims. And this is true regardless of whether the claims align with their politics or not. So again, this is not some kind of politically motivated reasoning. It's just sort of like thinking is good. And so the original one of these papers we called like lazy, not biased, and is saying that like your reasoning isn't biased. The problem is that people just have biases initially and they don't engage in reasoning to overcome them. We've also found this in a bunch of different countries. We've got one cross-cultural paper that I'll sort of refer to a number of times through this talk, where we do a bunch of the things that we've done previously in the US across 16 countries on all 6 continents and all 6 inhabited continents. And everywhere we find that people that engage in more reasoning are less likely to believe false claims. We also have a paper that does this in the Ukraine with Kremlin disinformation. And this is just like, this is a very robust phenomena. And obviously this is just correlational, but there's also evidence that this is really a causal effect. So we have one paper that shows that if you put people under time pressure and cognitive load while they're assessing headlines, it makes them, so you artificially reduce the amount of deliberation they're able to engage in by distracting them. That makes them more likely to believe false claims, again, regardless of whether those claims align with their politics or not. And we also have a paper that says if you get people to rely on emotion, it makes them more likely to believe false claims, again, regardless of whether it aligns with their politics or not. Essentially like lack of reasoning is bad and reasoning is good. And then the other thing that makes people selectively more likely to believe false claims is a lack of literacy, where it could be digital literacy, it could be media literacy, This is like a not very well theorized area, the like digital media literacy area, where there's lots of different measures that people use that are not sort of, it's not conceptually clear what exactly people mean, or they mean a lot of different things. But for this particular outcome, it actually doesn't matter, more or less, no matter what measure of media literacy you look at, people that do better on it are less likely to believe false claims. So for example, we have a paper that looks at a bunch of these measures, and we find that, for example, if people that are like that self-report more familiarity with internet-related terms are less likely to believe falsehoods. People that understand how the Facebook newsfeed algorithm works, that is, they understand that it's picked by a computer and not by human editors or at random, do better. People that understand sort of the way news works in general, like the difference between different kinds of news outlets, and just sort of procedural knowledge about how the news works, are less likely to believe falsehoods. And also we show in that paper that these digital literacy or these sort of literacy measures are independent from critical thinking or general education level. They're just sort of two things that separately each predispose you to not being like fooled by falsehoods. And in addition to the this correlational evidence, there's also manipulation studies where people give digital literacy trainings or tips and find that it improves people's ability to tell truth from falsehood. Not all of these are successful, but a bunch of them are. And so one example is this paper by Andy Guess and colleagues, where they showed people this set of 12 digital literacy tips. There were tips that Facebook had put together somehow and shown to millions of people around the world. And so Andy was curious whether they actually work. And so he did a study where he showed people the tips and then, or didn't, and then had them judge the accuracy of a bunch of news headlines. And what he found was that after getting the media literacy tips, there was a substantial reduction in the fraction of false headlines that people believed, and there was only a very small decrease in the fraction of true headlines that people believed. So overall, they got substantially better at telling true from falsehood after getting the digital literacy tips. And he also did some follow-up and found out the effect sort of shrunk a little bit over time, but was still evident in a follow-up. So while repetition, alignment with pre-existing beliefs and trusted sources makes you believe things regardless of whether they're true or not, lack of reasoning and lack of literacy make people specifically likely to believe falsehoods. So with this kind of like high-level summary of the psychology of misinformation, what I'm going to switch to now for the rest of the time is to talk about ways to actually combat misinformation. What can be done? And I have a particular focus on what social media companies can do, not necessarily because I think social media is the biggest problem or like the place where the most misinformation is. I think like in the US, for example, Fox News and, has like probably has done more to spread misinformation than Facebook. But the reason that I focus on social media is it's a place where there's actually some potential for intervention, which is that the people that are distributing the content are not the same people that are producing the content. And so if the platforms wanted to, they could sort of intervene. Like, Fox is has no incentive to change, what it's doing, but, theoretically, Facebook or Twitter or something like that could. So, okay, what do social media platforms do? Well, first and foremost, they're technology companies. And so their sort of first line defense against misinformation is a technological solution, which is using machine learning and artificial intelligence to build classifiers that identify false claims. And, that's fine and is good that they're doing that. But it's not great that it doesn't work that well, even after all this time. And part of the reason that it doesn't work that well is, when I basically, the first issue is it's hard to put together good training sets. The way these models work is you have to give it a set where you know, well, these ones are true and these ones are false, and then it learns the signatures of what's true versus false. And before I started working on this stuff, I was like, well, I mean, it seems easy enough. You got the true claims and you got the false claims, and they should just learn it. You know, if they're not doing it, it's because they must not really be trying or something. But then once you start working in it, the space, and actually looking at these headlines and stuff, you realize that the truth is not this like very clean true false like dichotomy. When you're actually out looking at the stuff that's circulating, it's much more of like a continuum of like how problematic or misleading is this content. And so it makes it really hard to put together good training sets. And the other issue is what they call non-stationarity, which is to say that the misinformation is constantly evolving. And so if you're training your models on yesterday's misinformation, it's not often going to allow you to be prepared for tomorrow's misinformation that has evolved from where it used to be. So I think there's a recognition that although the algorithms are great, it's not enough, and you need some sort of human in the loop. And the main way that that happens is with platforms partnering with professional fact-checking organizations. Like in the US, there's Snopes.com or PolitiFact. You know, I also think professional fact-checking is great. The way it works is, you know, with professional fact checkers, you know, research an article and they conclude that it's false or it's misleading, or maybe if two different fact checkers conclude that it's false, then, you know, the platforms will take action against it. So for example, they might demote it, which means they sort of push it down in the news feed. So they just make it so it's less likely that people see that content, or they might put warning labels on the content. And so obviously demotion works in the sense that if you demote a piece of content, people just definitionally are less likely to see it, therefore less likely to share it, and, you know, less likely to believe it. So great. But demotion has issues around censorship. Although, you know, in some sense, I feel like some of the complaint about demotion as censorship doesn't appreciate the fact that the algorithm is always favoring some content over other content. You never see anywhere close to the total amount of content that the people that you follow produce. So there's always some censorship happening. And so it's just a question of like, what do you want to prioritize? Like, do you want them to push the things that are going to get the least clicks to the bottom, or push things that seem problematic to the bottom, or whatever? So anyways, demotion clearly works, but there's a question of, do warning labels work or not? And so we ran a study where we assessed the effectiveness of warning labels. In one study, we used the actual little warning labels that Facebook was using at that time, which were these like little thing across the bottom that said disputed by third-party fact checkers. It was like if you were trying to design a tag that had a minimum chance of doing anything, that would have been the one that you designed. So we did that in the first study, and then this is the second study where we built something ourselves that was a little bit harder to miss. So what we did was, we showed people a set of headlines in Facebook format, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning. And in the control, we just said for each one, would you share it or not? And then in the treatment, we said for 3/4 of the false headlines, we put a big false stamp across them. And we found that for those headlines with the warning, there was a substantial reduction in sharing. So basically the label, and we explained that these labels came from third-party fact-checking sites and what third-party fact-checking sites were, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the label cut sharing in half. So that, you know, was good. But we also, you know, an important part of fact-checking is they don't catch everything. So we also looked, we made it so that although 3/4 of the false headlines had labels on them, 1/4 of the false headlines didn't have any label on them, you know, representing the ones that fact checkers would have missed. And there we found a significant increase in the sharing of the unlabeled headlines. This is what we called the implied truth effect. And we basically did like a Bayesian reasoning model and also some survey questions to support this idea that the idea is like, if you know that false claims are getting labeled, then when you see something that doesn't have a label, you think, well, it might have been checked and verified. And so, you know, that makes people believe it more. So this is, you know, this is problematic, particularly when you're thinking about like the fact that fact checkers can't really fact check everything, or really get anywhere close to it. And so, basically my take is that, debunking works, like fact checking claims works. You don't have to worry about these kind of backfires where, if you tell somebody something that they want to believe is false, they're going to dig in and so on and so forth. Sorry, question?
Oh, yeah. So in the previous slide, the false label means for sure it's false, or I'm just wondering why people still share, even though they know it's false. So is it with the certainty or with certain probability, so they might still share?
No, so so what we tell them is, 75% of the headlines are going to have going to be evaluated by fact checkers. If the fact checkers say it's false, we'll put a false label on it. Otherwise, we won't. And so, there are a lot of people that either don't trust the fact checkers or don't care that the fact checkers said it was false. But like a lot of people, that is, to me, cutting the sharing in half is like a major success.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I thought it's also interesting still 15% people sharing. And I would just wonder, it seems to indicate that there's some different motives why people share the news, not really trying to share truthful news, or what's the reason for sharing those false news? That's
and so my guess is that most of that is people not believing the fact checker.
Okay.
But I'll talk a lot more about these motives for sharing in a little bit.
So in your study, did you ask people whether they believe it and check that, or?
So you can't, because that dramatically changes their sharing behavior, as I will show in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. So let's come back to that. Come back to that in a second. So, this is another study by Porter and Wood. It's a terribly confusing chart, but basically they like debunked a whole bunch of different false claims in a bunch of different countries. And this is like how much people believe it. The green is the control and the blue is after they get a correction. And for every claim in every country, people believed it less after getting the correction. So like, that's good. In general, corrections reduce belief. The details of how it's done, I mean, you can do things more or less effectively, but in general, just like corrective information tends to correct, although not fully. And also there's evidence that corrections tend to fade over time, but still correcting is good. But the main challenge is coverage. Like there's just no way that basically professional fact checking doesn't scale. There's not very many professional fact checkers, even in places like the US that have a long history of this, let alone a lot of other places in the country where there's no sort of institutionalized professional fact checking. And so there's just no way that the professional fact checkers can keep up with the vast amount of content that's posted online every day. So, we need some other kinds of solutions that are more scalable. And so I'll talk about in the next section is some work that we've been doing around more scalable approaches to reducing the spread of misinformation. And we're going to start with a sort of basic science question that's very much related to what you were asking a moment ago about why is it that people share misinformation in the first place. And maybe the simplest explanation is that people are just confused. Oh, sorry, did I freeze for a second? And so if the question is like, why do people share misinformation? Well, the simplest explanation is just that people can't tell what's true. They're doing their best. They're only sharing things that they think are true, and they're just mixed up. And maybe the fact checker result in the past speaks a little bit against that. But to get some other insight into how well this can account for what's going on, we ran a bunch of studies, of which I will show you one example here, where we recruited about 1,000 Americans. We showed them a set of 24 headlines, again, half true, half false, half conservative leaning, half liberal leaning, and they were randomized into two different conditions. In the sharing condition, for each one, they were asked whether they would share it. And in the accuracy condition, the people in the accuracy condition were asked, is the claim accurate? And so, here I'm going to start with the accuracy ratings. I'm going to show you the fraction of headlines that were rated as accurate based on whether it's false in green or true in yellow, and whether it aligns with the person's politics or doesn't. And what you see is that for this particular sample and set of headlines, they're doing quite well, where they rate the true headlines as vastly more accurate than the false headlines, and they only believe the concordant headlines a bit more than the discordant headlines. So it's not the case that politics trumps truth. Like here, the actual objective truth of the article is the main driver of the accuracy ratings. And so if the sharing was just about confusion, you would expect this plot to look generally similar to this plot, but it doesn't. When for the people that you asked about sharing, whether the headline was true or false had almost no impact on the sharing probability, but they were much more likely to share headlines that aligned with their politics compared to ones that didn't. And this is most stark if you look at the headlines that were false but aligned with people's politics. Here, the people in the sharing condition were about twice as likely to say they would share the headline as people in the accuracy condition were to rate it as accurate. So clearly there's some disconnect between accuracy judgments and sharing intentions. And this is not only true in the US. This is from our big cross-cultural study across 16 different countries. What I'm going to plot here is the level of discernment. So this is the difference in accuracy ratings for true versus false headlines, and the difference in sharing intentions for true versus false headlines. And so what you see is in every country, the difference between accuracy judgments for true and false headlines is larger than the difference in sharing intentions. So if you look at the US, this is along the lines of what I showed you in the last plot. They rate the accurate headlines as the true headlines as substantially more accurate than the false headlines, but they're only slightly more likely to share the true headlines compared to the false headlines. And this is true on average, although it does vary a lot across countries, like how big of a disconnect there is. And so the question is, okay, why is there this disconnect? And perhaps the most natural explanation that might come to mind for you is, oh, we're living in this post-truth world where people don't care about accuracy anymore, or at least they don't care about it as much as they care about other things like partisanship. And so they're perfectly happy to share things that they think are false. So if you just ask people, how important is it to share accurate content? People overwhelmingly around the world say it's very important, but okay, fine, that doesn't really doesn't carry that much weight. But what we are proposing in some previous work is that actually is true, that in general, most people don't want to share false content, but the problem is that they're distracted. When you're on actual social media, you're scrolling quickly, the news is mixed in with baby pictures and cat videos, all of this emotionally evocative stuff that doesn't put you in a kind of rational mindset. And a lot of the time you go on social media because you want to relax and unwind, not because you want to think critically. And then furthermore, when you're on social media, whenever you see a post or you make a post, you get this immediate quantified social feedback about how many people liked it, how many people shared it, how many people commented it, and so on. And so it really focuses your attention on all of these social considerations. And so even if you're a person that does really care about accuracy, which is to say, if you realize something was inaccurate, you would not want to share it. You often will wind up sharing it because you just forget to stop and think, is this accurate or not? Because you're thinking about other stuff. And I've actually had that happen myself as someone that spends all my time thinking about this stuff, where I shared something because it looked good. And then someone was like, hey, is that actually true? And I was like, ah. So that's the proposal. And if that's true, then just getting people to consider the concept of accuracy should cause them to be more discerning in what they share. And so we've tested this in a lot of different ways, but as one sort of most heavy-handed example, we showed people again a set of headlines, half true, half false, half right-leaning, half left-leaning, and we asked them, and this one, if you were to see it on Facebook, how likely would you be to share it? And in the control, that's it. And consistent with what I showed you before, there's not much difference in sharing probability between the true and false headlines. I should also say that pretty much every study that I show you is a different set of headlines. And we do this, you have to keep the headlines fresh so that they're relevant. And also it's important to show that it's not specific to some weird idiosyncratic set of headlines we picked one time. So we've used hundreds and hundreds of different headlines at this point, and we always find consistent results. So at baseline, not much difference in sharing intention for true versus false headlines. And then in the treatment, it's exactly the same, except we ask them whether they think it's accurate, and then we ask them if they would share it. So we're not providing them any information about accuracy, or that is, we're not telling them what's true or what's not. We're not even telling them that they should not share false things. We're just forcing them to think through accuracy before they decide what to share. And what we find is that this cuts the sharing of false content in half. And because now in the treatment we have these accuracy ratings, we can further decompose this sort of 15% of false headlines that people said that they were likely to share, even though they rated the accuracy, into whether they thought it was true or false. And so the fact that sharing is cut in half when you just make them think about accuracy suggests that half of this baseline sharing was simply due to inattention and like forgetting to think about what's accurate or not. And if you split this up, you see that the large majority of the headlines that people said that they would share, they incorrectly thought were accurate, even though they weren't. So this is sort of confusion. And there was a very small chunk of the headlines where the person said they thought it was not accurate and said that they would share it anyways. And these exact percentages are going to depend on the headlines, and maybe this is deflated to some extent by social desirability. But the point is that attention is important. It's not some little thing on the margin, but it's really an important element of what's going on here. But obviously, it's totally infeasible to ask social media companies to have people rate the accuracy of every single item on their timeline. And so what we have done next in this research program is try to think about what are things that you can do to just sort of nudge people to consider accuracy in a more gentle way. And so the thing that we've done the most of is at the beginning of the study, before they know anything what the main study is about, we just ask them to rate the accuracy of a random non-political headline. This sort of makes the concept of accuracy salient, so then when they go on to the main study, they're more likely to think to themselves, oh, are these other headlines accurate? And so it should increase accuracy salience. And as one example, here's a study where we do that, and we find that asking about the accuracy of one random headline at the beginning significantly reduces the sharing probability for false headlines. When this is something we've done again many times. We have another paper where we show that you can do it a bunch of different ways. Giving minimal digital literacy tips does the same thing. Asking people how important they think it is to only share accurate content. Almost everybody says very important or extremely important, and then goes on to share less fake things afterwards. Providing social norm information works. In this particular paper, it didn't work that well. In some other papers, we found that it does work better. There's a lot of different ways to do it. And we have a paper that just came out in Nature Communications where we meta-analyze, we do like an internal meta-analysis of like every study that we ran 2017 through 2020. So unlike a lot of other meta-analyses, it doesn't have problems of like file drawer effects and p-hacking and stuff like that, because we know we have the full set of studies. They're included regardless of outcome. We use the same analytic approach on all the studies. And we find this very robust effect where prompting people to think about accuracy significantly increases sharing discernment. It works for political headlines, regardless of whether they're aligned with your politics or not. It also works for COVID-related news. It works for both conservatives and liberals. It works for a really wide variety of headlines and wide variety of ways to prompt people to think about accuracy. And it lasts at least for the full duration of the experimental session. That's evidence that it works in survey experiments in the US. We also included this in our cross-cultural experiment. And in the cross-cultural experiment, we used COVID headlines. You could use the same set of COVID headlines everywhere in the world. We found that there were some places where asking about accuracy at the beginning substantially increased how discerning their sharing was. And this effect is entirely driven by reducing the sharing of false content. So in some places you get a big reduction in the sharing of false content. In other places you don't get much of a reduction, and there's nowhere that it significantly backfires. The meta-analytic estimate is that, you know, it increases the sharing discernment by about 18%. But there clearly is variation across countries. And so we want to understand what's the variation across countries about. And if you think about it, like, what is this intervention supposed to do? It's supposed to shift people's attention to accuracy. So that is, it's supposed to close that gap between how discerning the accuracy judgments were and how discerning the sharing judgments were. But as I told you earlier, the extent to which accuracy judgments and sharing judgments were disconnected varied a bunch across countries. And so in countries where accuracy is a lot more discerning than sharing, you would expect that getting them to think about accuracy should really help, because it will move this up in the direction of, you know, move sharing up in the direction of the accuracy judgments. But for countries where there wasn't that much of a difference in the first place, getting them to think about accuracy isn't really going to help. And that's exactly what we find. If you look at for each country, this is showing like how much more discerning accuracy judgments were than sharing judgments in the baseline. And then this is looking at the effect of, you know, getting them to think about accuracy on their sharing. You know, a very large amount of this variation in the effectiveness of the accuracy prompt is explained by just how much of a disconnect there is at baseline. So this is sort of, you know, further evidence that what the intervention is doing is just getting people to think about accuracy when they're deciding what to share. And you get a similar story when you look at variation across headlines. So in this study, we used 45 different headlines. And so I'm going to show you is for each headline, how accurate did people think it was in one condition where they judged accuracy? And then on the y-axis, I'm going to show you how much does getting people to think about accuracy reduce the sharing of that headline. And you see this amazingly strong correlation where headlines that were pretty believable are not affected by getting people to think about accuracy, whereas headlines that seem like really crazy are substantially reduced when you prompt people to think about accuracy. And, you know, what matters is not the actual objective accuracy, it's just sort of, or the objective truth, it's just sort of like how plausible it seems, because that's the only thing that sort of people have access to. So this is a lot of survey evidence, a lot of evidence from survey experiments that getting people to think about accuracy improves the quality of what they share. But, you know, I came from a sort of experimental economics tradition before I got into all this misinformation work. And, you know, when I started this, I was like, oh, self-reports are bad, you know, and then I was like, oh, well, for accuracy judgments, there's not really any way you can get at what people believe other than by asking them. Like in this case, you can't actually incentivize the guesses, because then it changes the question to, instead of what they believe you believe. And when you're talking about politics and stuff like that, you know, it doesn't really work. So, okay, fine, for accuracy, you have to ask about it. And for sharing intentions, I was like, well, obviously we'd like to observe real sharing, but, you know, we're not Facebook, so this is the best that we can do. And that was true for a while. And then we figured out a way to do actual field experiments with real sharing on Twitter. And so we did this field experiment. We created a bunch of these accounts that were officially, they explicitly were bots, and they were sort of non-political bots. They're like cooking bots. And we used these accounts to follow over 130,000 users who had shared links to Breitbart or InfoWars, sort of far right sites that share a lot of false or misleading claims. Of those 136,000 people, about 11,000 of them followed us back. So now there are followers that we can send private messages to. And so that's going to be like the subject in our field experiment. We went through that list and we excluded about 6,000 users that seemed like they were either bots themselves or hadn't been active recently. And so we wound up with a final subject pool of 5,379 users who, not knowing they were part of an experiment, we just sent them a message saying, hey, thanks for following me. Can you do me a favor? I'm wondering how accurate this headline is, and I'm doing a survey to find out. Basically, nobody responded to the question, but that's fine. we don't need them to respond. We just need them to open it and read the top sentence, and they've been treated in the sense that the concept of accuracy has been activated in their mind. So when they quit out of this and go back to their feed, they'll be more likely to think to themselves, oh, well, how accurate is the next thing I see? How accurate is the next thing I see? In order to do causal inference, we used a step wedge or randomized rollout design where everyone got the message, but we randomized who got the message on which day. So it's like every day is its own mini experiment where you can compare the links that are shared like after getting the message from the people who got the message that day, who are like the treatment, and compare that to everyone who hasn't gotten the message yet, who are the control. And then you basically aggregate the effect sizes across all of the different days of the experiment. And consistent with the survey experiments, we found a significant increase in the quality of the news that people shared. And as one way to visualize it, I'm going to show you this domain level plot. The size of the dot is proportional to the baseline sharing in the subject pool. So you see these people shared a lot of Breitbart and a lot of Fox News at baseline. And then on the x-axis, we have our sort of quality measure, which is the trustworthiness of the news site as rated by professional fact checkers. And on the y-axis, we have the treatment effect. So it's the change in fraction of tweets that contained links to each of these sites after receiving them, as a result of receiving the message. So positive means increased fraction from the message increased, negative means decreased. And the key result here is there's this strong positive correlation such that the accuracy prompt increased the alignment between the fraction of links shared and the fact checker quality ratings. Sort of increased sharing of sites that fact checkers said was good and decreased sharing of sites that fact checkers said were not good. Question?
Yeah, very cool. Is this the immediate effect you're looking at, or like how long?
24 hours. So the thing is that we don't know when they saw the message or if they saw the message. We only know when we sent it. Yeah. And so we do this sort of intent to treat effect where we assume that the second we saw the message, they've been treated. And we look for 24 hours afterwards. And we're sort of locked into the 24-hour chunk because of this stepped wedge design. We're like messaging new people every 24 hours. And so the like control group only sort of is pure for 24 hours for a given person. And then we basically didn't have enough power to look further out than that. My guess is that these effects don't last that long because attention is fickle. And this isn't something where it's like you get an accuracy prompt once and then you're good for the rest of your life. But instead, the idea is that the platforms have been like creating an attention environment or an attention ecosystem where people are chronically not paying attention to accuracy. But if you can redirect, it will improve the quality of what they share. And so it's sort of like the way this should be implemented is more at like a systems level of being like, look, you need to do things systematically to redirect attention to accuracy. And one potential way of doing that is like, while people are scrolling through their feeds, here is a pop-up. I'm going to show it, or they could just do it as like a card in feed. You could say, pop-up, hey, help us inform our algorithms. Here's some random headline. Do you think it's accurate or not? And the idea is even if they threw away the answers, just asking the question would be helpful because it prompts people to think about accuracy and sort of to reflect on that. So, I think that this is a powerful approach for increasing the quality of what people share. And some like what's nice about it is it doesn't rely on a centralized definition of what's true or false. It's just kind of like getting people to think a little bit about it themselves and leveraging the fact that most people don't want to share false claims and are actually not terrible at telling true from false if they think about it. And so, it's scalable. We also do some simulations in the paper to show that it's amplified by network effects, because if I don't share something, none of my followers see it, and so none of their followers see it, and none of their followers see it, and so on. This implementation was just the first thing that occurred to us, and what we hope is that platforms would take this seriously and use their ability to do really large-scale experiments to try lots of different kinds of treatment effects and figure out how to optimize for things like size of effect and persistence of effect and so on. So this is all evidence that some chunk of misinformation sharing is due to people just not paying attention. So, you know, we said, okay, great. If you nudge people to think about accuracy, they're more discerning in what they share. What if instead you give people a shove instead of a little gentle nudge? What we did in this paper was we found people who had shared links to false stories that had been debunked by Snopes, and we responded from an account. In this case, the account looked like a human that was a sort of politically active human, and said, hey, don't know if that's true, here's this debunking message. And then we targeted 2,000 users for corrections, and then we looked at the quality of the news that they share afterwards. And our hope was this would increase the quality of what they share, just like the accuracy prompts did. But in fact, what we found was the opposite. So here what I'm showing you is the distribution of shared content where this is the quality again as measured by fact checkers. In green you have pre-treatment, and in purple you have post-treatment. So you see that the treatment is decreasing the share of tweets that have high quality and increasing the fraction of retweets that have low quality. And also you see an increase in partisan slant and language toxicity. And actually for both this and the nudge, the effect is only seen in retweets and not in primary tweets, which fits with this kind of attention account. Because retweets are where you're just kind of like not really thinking, you're scrolling through your feed, you're mashing the button, you're not paying attention. Whereas primary tweets, you carefully slave over them to make sure every character is right and fit in the limit and so on. And so basically you only see these interventions affecting the like low attention behavior of retweeting, which suggests that this isn't about a kind of reactance of like, oh, don't tell me what to do, blah, blah, blah. Because if it was that, it would also show up in the primary tweets. But the fact that it's only in the retweets makes us think it's essentially another attention thing where like we thought that getting corrected for sharing something false would redirect your attention to accuracy, but it seems like instead it's directing your attention to other social things like being embarrassed or things like that. So that's the shove idea. And basically, I think that the take home is attention is complicated, and also no platforms should be taking things from published papers and just popping them right into their I mean, not that I think anyone would do that anyways, but the point is you need to test this stuff, and like what any intervention that anyone is thinking about using in any serious way, they need to do a test first, because they don't always work the way you think they will. And so then the final thing that I want to talk about is, I was saying in this kind of nudge version where I say, hey, help inform our algorithms, here's this random headline, the platforms could just throw away the responses to this accurate, inaccurate question, and that would be fine. Or it would still be useful because it would, prime them to think about accuracy. But then we also are wondering, should the platforms throw away these answers, or might they actually be helpful? And in particular, as I mentioned, earlier in the talk, the main challenge for professional fact checking is that it doesn't scale. There's just like, not nearly enough fact checkers to keep up with all the misinformation that's getting posted. But crowds do scale. There's millions and millions of users. And so if you could if these sort of user ratings were actually useful in generating signal about whether the content was accurate or not, that's a way that you could get a scalable signal. And obviously you wouldn't trust the judgment of any one random person, but there's 100 years of evidence on the wisdom of crowds, where if you get enough crowd judgments, crowds can do really well, even on tasks that require a lot of expertise. So we wanted to see if it also worked here. And in a partnership with Facebook, they gave us a set of URLs that their internal algorithms had flagged as things they wanted fact checks for, either because they seemed false, or they just were going viral, or they were about important topics. And we took 207 of these headlines. We had 3 professional fact checkers research each article in detail and rate its accuracy. And then we also hired like 1,100 non-expert Americans for very small amounts of money to just read the headline and lead sentence and say how accurate they thought it was. And we also varied whether we told them the domain it came from or not to see if that helped or hurt. And the question was, how well does the results of the fact checker research line up with these crowd headline ratings? And how does that change as a function of how big the crowd is? So basically, can you get good agreement with the fact checkers? And if so, how big of a crowd do you need? And so what I'm going to show you here is the correlation between the layperson headline readings and the fact checker research ratings as a function of the number of layperson judgments and whether we told them the source URL or not, or the source domain or not. And you also need some kind of baseline, like what counts as like good performance. And what we take as our baseline is the correlation between the fact checkers, because although the fact checkers, their ratings were highly correlated, they were far from perfectly correlated. So they correlated about 0.6, which lines up with things that other people have found in other studies of professional fact checking. And what we found was that with maybe 15 or 20 lay people per headline, you're getting as much agreement between the lay people and the fact checkers as you're getting amongst the fact checkers themselves. So we think this is evidence that the crowd ratings can actually, it's not perfect. The fact checkers aren't perfect either, and this is a way that you can get some reasonable signal in a scalable way. And if you split the headlines up for non-political versus political headlines, the agreement between the lay people and the fact checkers is pretty much the same for both types of news, but the agreement amongst the fact checkers was actually lower for the political than the non-political. So if you want to think about the performance of the crowd as compared to the fact checker benchmark, they did even better for the political headlines than the non-political headlines. And this is also not restricted just to the US. In our big cross-cultural study, we can do the same thing. We had a condition where we had people rating the accuracy of all these COVID headlines, and then we can look at the like how well you can predict which headlines are true versus false based on the crowd ratings. We use this area under the curve measure from machine learning because it wasn't a balanced headline set. It wasn't half true, half false. So this is basically like accuracy, what the accuracy would be if the headline set was balanced on veracity. And it's a function of the number of the size of the crowd across all these different countries. And what you see, like I said, animation is broken, so let me do it by hand. What you see is that what you see is that everywhere pretty much with so almost everywhere with 20 lay people per headline, you're doing greater than 90% accuracy, and even in a couple of places where it's not so well, it's still better than 85%, which I think is better than most of the machine learning algorithms. So like this is, it's not only in the US that the crowds can help assess things, and this is true for sort of medical related COVID stuff. And so, this is something that platforms are taking seriously. Facebook has this community review product where they basically hire lay people to fact check articles. And so I sort of advise them on that. And Twitter has introduced Birdwatch, which is their version of this, where just any person can sign up for Birdwatch. And if they're admitted to the program, they can just in their timeline, they can flag any tweet they want as potentially misleading and then write a little note about why they think it is or is not problematic. And then they can also go to a centralized Birdwatch site where they can see all the other notes that other people wrote and write their own notes and rate the other people's notes and so on. And I'm also an advisor to Twitter on that. And so the final thing that I want to tell you about is what happens in this context, because the Birdwatch is very different. Like in the Facebook model, it's like what happens in our survey experiments where people come in and they are just given headlines and said, hey, rate this headline, rate this headline. They don't get to choose what they're flagging and what they're, they don't get to choose what they're evaluating or not evaluating. And so there's not really any opportunity for coordinated attacks or kind of gaming of the system, because they just have to rate the things that are in front of them. But in the Twitter context, you could imagine that there is a lot of this sort of partisanship or politics driving what content people choose to rate or not rate. And so what we did is we got the data for the 4,000 people that were part of the initial Birdwatch pilot, and we looked at all of the notes that they wrote. So every time they flagged a tweet, they could either say it's misleading or not misleading. And what I'm going to show you here is 1 dot per note that birdwatchers wrote. And this is the political score of the person that wrote the tweet. And this is the political score of the person that wrote the note. And red means the note writer said the tweet writer's tweet was bad, and blue said it was fine. And what you see is this like really striking pattern where, first of all, like, something like 90% of the flags are misleading. They're basically all flagging things as bad, and it's essentially all happening on the off diagonals, where it's like liberals are flagging tweets written by conservatives, and conservatives are flagging tweets written by liberals. And so this seems bad, but we have actually a follow-up project where we then hired fact checkers to actually read a bunch of these tweets and rate them. And actually, the crowd is doing pretty well, which is that like most of these tweets that are flagged as misleading are actually misleading. So it's not that they're just flagging counterpartisan tweets at random, but it's essentially like the Republicans are flagging false Democratic tweets and the Democrats are flagging false Republican tweets. And so it's like the two sides are policing each other. So that's that's the next sort of stage in this project, is digging more into that. And so just to summarize this, crowds are great because they're scalable and they're fast. And again, it doesn't rely on a centralized definition of truth that one person is deciding, but there is the big challenge is it's a public goods challenge, where the ratings are, generate a public good by identifying misinformation, but they require the raters to incur the cost of taking the time to do the ratings. And so that's the big question, is how do you motivate people to provision the public good of providing crowd ratings? And there's also the challenge of the tyranny of majority, which is to say that, in the US, Democrats and Republicans are pretty equally balanced, so they kind of, cancel each other out. But if you're looking at, situations where you've got an ethnic majority and an ethnic minority, then the crowds of the ethnic majority can endorse falsehoods about the ethnic minority, and so on and so forth. And so that's like a design and algorithm question of like, how do you do crowds in a way that that doesn't have that issue? So overall, to summarize, repetition, consistency with prior beliefs, and coming from trusted sources makes people more likely to believe claims regardless of whether they're true or false. And not engaging in reasoning and not having enough literacy selectively increase belief in false claims. And then when it comes to combating misinformation, AI and professional fact checkers are great, but they're not enough. And we find that lay people are surprisingly good at judging and invested in information quality if they bother to pay attention. And so doing things that shift users' attention to accuracy will increase the quality of the news that they share. And you can use crowdsourcing to identify low quality sites and low quality articles. And these both offer scalable approaches that don't rely on a centralized authority deciding what's true and what's not true. And so we think that there's no silver bullet, there's no one thing that's going to solve the misinformation problem, but our goal here is to expand the toolkit that platforms have to try to reduce this kind of stuff if they are actually so inclined. And so we're saying these are things that should get added to that toolkit. So thanks to all of you for listening. And thanks to my many collaborators on this project, of all the stuff that I showed you, of which this is a subset. And Gord Pennycook is really my closest collaborator on essentially all of this stuff. And also thanks to all the people that gave me money. And from a conflict of interest perspective, I should say I don't ever get any consulting fees from social media companies, but I have had research projects funded by gifts from Facebook, gifts to MIT from Facebook and Google. So yeah, that's what I had to say, and excited for Q&A. And I guess I'll leave the slides up in case people have questions that I can reference in the deck.
Thank you so much, David. This is really interesting. Now we're open for a discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, or if you would like to just leave it in the chat box, that's fine.
So I see a first question about what Elon Musk thinks about fact checkers. Obviously, he's not excited about it, but I think he's wrong. But also, I think that the sort of core claim that animates a lot of Elon Musk and conservatives in the U.S. is the claim that platforms discriminate against conservatives. And that is an empirical claim, but it has not actually been empirically investigated that much. And so we have a working paper that we just posted a few weeks ago where we tried to actually empirically evaluate that. I don't have it in the deck, but here I'll drop a link in the chat. And essentially what we did is we followed we've identified like 9,000 Twitter users that had been sharing partisan hashtags, either like Trump 2020 hashtags or Biden 2020 hashtags during immediately before the US presidential election in 2020. And then we followed those 9,000 users for 7 months, and we saw which ones got suspended and which ones didn't. And we found that the Republicans were like 4 times more likely to get suspended than the Democrats, which looks like anti-Republican bias. But we also then analyzed the links that they were sharing and used a sort of misinformation score, either based on fact checkers or a misinformation score based on the crowd judgments. You have a politically balanced crowd evaluating the quality of the links or of the domains. You can't accuse that of bias. And we find that the sharing misinformation, like the amount of misinformation they shared, was as predictive of suspension as partisanship. So there's not actually any evidence of preferential suspension of conservatives. Okay, so another next one in the chat was both the nudges and the shoves towards checking that you described seemed emotionally neutral. Is there any merit or demerit for testing more emotion-based interventions to promote fact-checking, e.g. lives are ruined by the spread of misinformation? Have you checked the accuracy of what you're sharing? Yeah, interesting. We haven't tried that, but it would be easy to do, and it would be cool, and you should do it. And our paradigm, we post all of our survey materials and stuff like that on OSF, and that would be a trivial modification to that would be a very easy thing to implement based on the materials that we have, and I would be very interested in knowing what happened. And I could sort of see it going either way. Next question in the chat was, I'm interested in this issue from the perspective of an artist or content creator. My aim is to create fictional content that gently shifts culture towards greater attention to accuracy and higher digital media literacy. What advice do you have for strategies? Yeah, it's interesting question. In some sense, I feel like the result of like the work that we've done so far suggests it doesn't really matter what you do. Like anything that kind of like invokes the idea of accuracy shifts people's attention to accuracy and increases the quality of what they share. And so I think the main issue here is going to be an attentional one of how do you get people's attention to pay attention to the thing about accuracy, which I guess is a more fundamental design question for social media of just like, how do you engage people's attention? I think Anka maybe had the next question.
Yes, thanks, David. Thanks for a fantastic talk. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. So I was just wondering, I'm really interested in the crowd outsourcing of fact checking. Do you have a view on the timing of these things? So how long would it take a crowd of like 100 or 50 people to check something compared with a fact checker?
Yeah, so
which one is faster, basically?
Right. It's a good question. In our work, we were really focused on scalability, which includes speed as well as literal scale. And so, like in the Science Advances paper, this one where we worked with the Facebook data, what we did is the fact checkers actually researched the article, and we asked them to try to take like not more than a half hour per article. Which is fast for fact checkers, but whatever, on average. But for the raters, we just showed them the headline and the lead, and we asked them to judge that. So it took them, like 10 seconds or something like that. Mm. And even though they were only doing the headline and lead, they got a high level of correlation. Obviously, they're only going on the plausibility, and there are things that are implausible but turn out to be true. And so this would get that wrong. But I think that that's fine in that this is supposed to essentially like put a break on crazy seeming stuff.
Yeah.
Spreading.
Because then if it's, sorry to just a quick follow up, if it's fairly fast, what you could do in terms of making them interested in doing this kind of work is to just say, have it public how well they are doing their fact checking compared with the crowd. And as have a little badge on their Twitter account saying, this is a 80% fact checker, or I'm a fact checker and I'm having an 80% hit rate or something, meaning that 80% of the time I agree with the crowd as to whether it's true or not.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I totally like those ideas. And I think that, so prior to getting into all this misinformation work, what I worked on was cooperation and public goods provisioning, and like mostly on reputation and the effect of reputation systems for getting people to provision public goods. And so I think like that's a very natural direction to go with this. And we're working with people at Google on, like Google Maps has done a bunch of this like local guides type stuff to try to get people to leave ratings and upload photos and stuff like that, where you have a little profile and it shows, you can see all the things that you contributed, and you get points that don't really mean anything, but like makes you feel fancy, and so on. And so we're talking about trying to do like local guides for the internet, essentially, leveraging the same kind of idea.
Cool. Thanks very much, David.
Can I just follow up that? Did you, in your talk, seems you mostly follow on political issues. Do you observe much difference between, for example, health-related COVID vaccine in terms of this accuracy, how layperson do as compared with a fact checker? Did you look at it?
Not really. So like in this study, in the cross-cultural study, it's this is all COVID stuff, and they did quite well. We sort of switched, in March 2020 to almost all COVID. So I think that in the, prior to that, we did all political stuff. And I think like, in the last 2 years, probably 75% of the studies that we've run have been COVID headlines. Although these days we use a mix, because in the US, COVID has gotten so politicized that it's like turned into like COVID is politics, essentially. So basically, no, we haven't ever found any, like everything that we found with the political headlines, we've also found with COVID headlines. Even in the very early days of COVID, like we have this psych science paper that, we ran the experiments in like the first 4 days of the COVID lockdown in the US. And then, we had a preprint up in 15 days or whatever. And it was just, hey, we did this stuff for politics. Look, we just ran the same 2 studies again using COVID headlines, and look, it looks the same.
Because I wonder whether, how efficient the layperson is, because there's just news everywhere, right? In terms of politics or COVID related, maybe the layperson just has as much information as professional one. Well, if we go to other categories, for example, some disease that many of us don't know about, there are not many news about, probably the layperson is not as effective.
Yeah, that seems plausible. I mean, I think that though part of the way that it's working is that you could certainly come up with false claims that lay people would never know were false. But also those claims would in general be boring and like not anything that anyone would want to share anyways. And so a part of what the crowd is picking up on is the kind of sensational falsehoods that people like to share. You know, and so I think that that's my vision of like a lot of what the crowd-based evaluation is going to do is it's going to dampen sensational stuff. And so on the one hand, it will you know, prevent sensational things from spreading, and it will put pressure on publishers or like content creators to make more boring headlines, which is great because nobody ever clicks into any of the articles to read their articles anyways, and everyone just reads the headline. And so if you could just have like not sensational headlines, I think that, you know, then the fake stuff would not be exciting to share.
Cool, thanks. There are more questions in the chat box, and Xiaojian also has been waiting for
Can I ask a question? This is very interesting, Debbie. I think it's a very pressing and important topic nowadays. So in the beginning you mentioned, also in the end you mentioned that whether we should trust the information depends on whether there's a trusted source of the information, right? I'm just wondering whether you can link something like a fact checking, you mentioned the talk, to a measure of the trusted source. So some people may think, for example, some people may think Fox News is a trustworthy source of information for the right people, but some leftists may think this is not trustworthy, right? So is there any way to objectively measure how trustworthy a source is, and how to link it to something like a
I think not really, basically, because I think that trust is like, it would be great if it was objective, but it's pretty subjective. And so I don't think that there's like going to be a way that you can convince people that are like diehard Fox fans that like anything else is credible, for example. And you know, and same in other areas. And so I think that the best that you can do, or well, okay, maybe that's an extreme statement, but one thing that you can do is in the context of political elites, they say lots of different things. And so you can try and amplify the actually accurate or reasonable things that that political elites say towards their followers to be more compelling. Like we have this paper on COVID vaccination, where so, you know, in the US, Republicans are like the largest like vaccination resistant subgroup. And we did this experiment where we recruited a bunch of Republicans and we showed them like a control or a video of Trump saying, hey, the vaccine is great, go get the vaccine. Or we showed them a video of Biden saying the thing is great, go get the vaccine. And not surprisingly, the Biden video didn't do anything and made them less likely to say, they were less likely to tell their friends to get vaccinated. But the Trump video significantly increased vaccination intentions. And it's the thing, like, you know, he doesn't say it very often or very loud because he gets booed when he says it, but he did sometimes say it. And with Trump in particular, he said literally everything about every issue. He said like both sides of every issue at some point he's said something about it, because he like high level of noise. And
it's
so
about reputation,
yeah.
will lead us to believe.
Yeah. So basically you can try and amplify the like actually accurate statements. Matt?
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thanks for your presentation there, David. Great work. And thank you also for doing this on a convenient time zone for us, but perhaps not you. I'm interested in the debate between the confusion-based account, which relies on analytic thinking, and I guess the more motivated or integrated account, where attitudes might play a part. And one thing that occurs to me is a lot of the literature on the confusion account considers misinformation that's been shared or asked questions about whether you would share it in an online environment. And in that literature, the needle points, I think, quite solidly towards the confusion or analytical kind of explanation. Do you think that would be different if you ask questions about whether people would share misinformation, perhaps in other environments like interpersonal conversations? And if you could extrapolate in that direction, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's interesting. So a couple of different things. I think first of all, just on the question of like, what happens if you're asking about other kinds of sharing? I think this is super interesting. I've had it on my to-do list for like 2 years. And it's another one of these things that would be like a trivial experiment to run, where you just like take our standard materials and change it to, instead of saying, would you share it on social media, say, would you share it with your friends, or would you share it with your family members, or like, would you talk about it at work? And just like see how much that changes things. And I don't know, honestly. I could see it going either way, where I could see it being that people are substantially more discerning when they're thinking about like, what would you tell your friends or family about? Or I could see it just like not making that much difference. And so I would like to know the answer, but I haven't gotten around to actually doing it. When somebody else does it, I would love to know what happens. But then more generally, I think this like analytic versus integrative thing, it doesn't make very much sense. Or rather, it's not. I think that the integrative folks are just like confused about what we ever have said, which is the integrative thing is saying, oh, like cognitive, like the amount that you think is not the only thing that matters. And it's like, yeah, of course, it's not the only thing that matters. Even like in our first paper, the like lazy not biased paper, we show that like how well people do on the CRT predicts truth discernment, and also how liberal versus conservative they are predicts truth discernment, and also some demographics predict truth discernment. You know, and the point is like there's a lot of things that are in the kitchen, and the point of the analytic account is like, it was sort of in the context of a specific debate with people best represented by Dan Kahan and the sort of motivated system 2 reasoning account, which said when people do reasoning, it actually makes them worse because people use their reasoning abilities in a motivated way. And so that was the main thing that our whole initial program was kind of a response to, which was saying like, no, look, when people think more, it's good. It's not that like thinking is bad. But I feel like somehow in some people's minds that evolved into thinking is the only thing that matters.
And I can see why the psychology people in particular try to find the primary reason for something as an explanation for the human mind. But for a lot of people, it doesn't really matter if both accounts are prevalent and address both.
Yeah, and they're not in any way like contradictory with each other. It's just like, yeah, there's a bunch of ththings that matter. And in the cross-cultural paper, I'm trying to see if I have this slide in this deck. I don't think I do. In the cross-cultural paper, we look at a whole bunch of different predictors. Oh, I know where I can get this. It's just in the paper itself, where we look at a whole bunch of different correlates of how well people can tell truth from falsehood. And so this is like essentially the correlation between the individual difference and accuracy discernment, like how much more they believe true versus false headlines. Each dot is one country, and then the big dot with the confidence interval is the meta-analytic estimate across countries. And so we've got these sort of like cognitive measures where people that like have a stronger preference for thinking or do better on the CRT or more like do better on the attention checks, they're more discerning. And then we've got like motivational things. So people that think accuracy is important do better, and people that think you should listen to evidence instead of just doing what the party tells you are better. And then we've also got ideological things. So like people that think democracy is important do better, and people that are more conservative do worse. And people that believe in God do worse. And then there's also, you know, various demographic stuff. So like, I feel like this is an integrative account in the sense of it's trying to say like specifically like, look, there's like a bunch of different things that matter, and they all matter pretty consistently, and they all matter roughly the same amount. And you know, like it's a complicated thing, and so obviously there's lots of different roads that can lead you to a particular outcome.
Well, thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I think we're closing to the end, and there are still remaining a couple of questions. If you could give a short answer to that, then we'll close today. One of the question was about the language, kind of related to the paper you put out here. Where is that? any idea why English-speaking populations seem to behave differently in your cross-cultural work?
No, I mean, so I think that in the paper, we really don't focus on the differences across countries, but the main point of it is like, what do we see that is consistent across countries? For example, like these correlations, in every country we see like a positive correlation between CRT and truth discernment. And saying we like, look, that's like a robust thing. Whereas we say with like moral relativism, wow, there's a pretty big spread. It's not consistent. So, who really knows what to make of that? And so I don't know. One possibility, obviously, is that there's something about the translations where, the English was just like better than the not English. I mean, we did our best where we hired one professional translator to translate all the instructions into the local language. And then we hired another translator to back translate it. And then we went through the back translation and fixed everything that wasn't good and went back to the original one and iterated on it until like it seemed good. But like, obviously, who knows? Or it could be something about the headlines that we chose or the statements that we chose, or things where like, there was some unintentional Anglo-centricness to the headlines that we picked or something like that. But yeah, I don't really know.
Cool. So last question from Julian about are there significant differences between platforms in the amount of misinformation that circulates, say Twitter versus Reddit versus Facebook? Perhaps a bit less about psychology, but wonder to what extent different algorithms may impact the amount of disinformation go around.
We really don't know, basically, because they're walled gardens. And so like you can see what's going on Twitter, but it's like really hard to know what is happening on essentially any of the other platforms. So probably, but we don't really have a good way of knowing, unfortunately.
Cool. Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, David. This is wonderful. And I think the audience also get the bonus with lots of information, literature, references from you. That's great. Can we save it? Zhongwen.
Oh, and actually that occurs to me as a final hurrah on that, in that vein. Here's this link I just dropped as a Google document that has links to all of our papers, like PDFs and summary tweet threads for everything we've done related to misinformation. So if you want more, check it out.
Very cool. I don't know how can you do this both at the same time. You need to teach me something.
It's amazing. You can reply and check out and also give us presentation at the same time.
Yeah, very impressed.
Well, I've got like two years of Zoom MBA teaching at this point, so I've got my different screens and my parallel processing, whatever.
Yeah, and this is I think 10 p.m. Your time. Thank you so much, David. This is really wonderful. I hope we will have a chance to invite you to come over to Australia at one point and talk in person. Lots of interest. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone being here. And see you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.